Let me tell you a story. And we begin this story in Kazakhstan on December 25th, 2019. Kazakhstan's largest city, Almaty, is home to the nation's busiest airport. It was bitterly cold as it normally is in the winters here. In the cold, cold sky, an aircraft arrives home after completing a scheduled round trip to and from the nation's capital. The aircraft was towed to a remote stand at the airport, where it remained for 30 hours. On the morning of December 27th, 2019, the same aircraft was scheduled to fly the route between Almaty and the capital again, Astana. The aircraft itself is an old 1996-built Fokker 100 plane. It's a twin-engine rear-mounted regional jet manufactured by the then long-defunct Dutch aircraft maker Fokker. The plane was actually based off of its predecessor, the Fokker 28. This particular Fokker 100 had jumped from carrier to carrier all over the world before arriving in Central Asia just a few years previously. The operator of this aircraft was a company known as Bek Air, an airline that only ever operated domestic flights within Kazakhstan. Like many startup airlines in this region of the world, they would acquire used, often older planes. In many of these cases, such as that with the accident aircraft, these planes were leased, and this one was actually owned by a leasing company in the Netherlands, who loaned it to Bek Air. That morning, Bek Air Flight 2100, the service to Astana, was to be flown by a crew of two. The captain, 58-year-old Marat Muratbayev, was a highly experienced pilot of over 20,000 flight hours. He had experience on a variety of planes ranging from those of the Soviet era all the way up to planes from the modern age. Nearly a fifth of his total flying time had been spent in the Fokker 100. The co-pilot, 54-year-old Mirjan Moldakalov, was another experienced pilot in his own right. With 11,000 flight hours behind him, he, similarly to the captain, he also had flown a variety of planes before landing on the Fokker 100, flying for Bek Air. Before the flight, the pilots had received weather information. Temperatures plummet here in the winter, and the weather conditions at the time were defined by an anticyclone system that brought freezing fog that enveloped the airport. It was very cold outside, negative 12 degrees Celsius. That's 10 degrees in freedom units. It wasn't snowing exactly, but freezing fog can bring ice, as moisture can freeze on airplane surfaces. The Fokker 100 manual defines icing conditions when the outside air temperature drops below 6 degrees Celsius in the presence of moisture. This includes snow, ice, rain, mist, sleet, and fog. This was clearly icing weather, and the plane had been left alone for 2 days before this crew got a hold of it on December 27th. It is still safe to fly in such weather so long as pilots, when they identify these conditions, ensure that critical flight services are free of ice, especially so when it comes to this plane in particular. Sure enough, the captain, following the routine walk-around of the aircraft, decided that de-icing was needed, but on this occasion, only determined that the tail structure required de-icing. He submitted a de-icing order, and 10 minutes later a truck rolled up on the stand and blasted the Fokker 100's tail with Type 1 de-icing fluid. Specifically 153 litres of the stuff. We are going to touch upon the various types of de-icing and anti-icing fluid later. However, for now, this fluid is a mixture of glycol and water applied warm to an aircraft to remove ice. The investigation provided this still from a surveillance camera, where we can observe the de-icing truck treating only the vertical stabilizer. Flight 2100 would be taking 98 passengers and crew on the journey to Astana that morning, to which boarding was completed at around 7 AM local time. The doors were closed and the engines were started. Before taxi, the pilot switched on the engine anti-ice. The Fokker 100, like all commercial passenger planes, is equipped with anti-ice systems that work by siphoning off some of the hot air created by the engine intake. Such hot air is useful for a number of functions, of which the engine and airframe anti-ice system is among them. It does tend to lead to a small loss in engine performance. The Fokker 100 does have wing anti-ice, but this is more of an in-flight system and really isn't all that useful on the ground, and also should not be used as a substitute for actual de-icing of the wings. The activation of engine anti-ice though on the Fokker 100 is supposed to activate a leading-edge ground heating system that was given the very literal name of the on-ground wing leading-edge heating system. This was actually not originally on the Fokker 100. This one had it installed in 2009. A retrofit for it became mandatory in Europe. I wonder why. It needs to be said, however, even this should not be used in lieu of de-icing of the wings. It's preventative insofar that it will only protect the plane from when it's switched on. Ice that may already be on the plane, such as that of the accident aircraft, should be removed through other means. And we are only talking about the leading edge here, that's not even to mention, the rest of the wing. Not that it mattered much in the end, the investigation later concluded that the system had malfunctioned anyway, which brought into question the maintenance practices at Bek Air. Taxi clearance was received, and Flight 2100 taxis down to runway 05 on the south side of the airport, ready for departure. The pilots had elected to perform a flapless takeoff this morning. Now, we should highlight that, on its own, this was not in violation of the operational procedures issued by Fokker. This jet was actually rated for flapless departures, unlike most other passenger planes. In the presence of icing conditions, however, this changes, for reasons that will become apparent later. The Fokker jet was waiting behind another aircraft ahead of its own departure. Once this plane, a comparatively brand new Airbus A320neo, began its takeoff roll, Flight 2100 followed in behind and held position on the runway. At 7:20 in the morning, Bek Air Flight 2100 was cleared for takeoff. Captain Muratbayev pushes the throttles forward, and the Fokker 100 jet begins to accelerate. The cockpit voice recording of this very short flight was released. What happened here was captured here on tape, and we will now play that for you. What you are about to hear is the audio from the inside of the cockpit during the takeoff attempt.
V1, rotate.
Wait, stop. Wait. Hi everyone, it's me! Look, if you just want to learn about what happened to Bek Air Flight 2100, you can go to this timestamp in the video, so you don't have to look at my silly face. Just so you know, we're not coming back to this for a while, so now's your chance to get the heck out of here while you still can. Okay? Okay. Alright, time to get Fokkered up. But first things first, let's see if we can change this background. No, I already used that. That's from the 737 MAX video. No, again, used it. It was just a recolor. No. Okay, you know what? This'll do. So, let me level with you. If you want to learn about all of the lore related to this plane and the condition that this flight faced, then you best come with me, my friend, because what happened here has 50 years of backstory behind it. Come join me, step decades back in time, and let's learn about the Fokker Enigma. It was a cold afternoon on February 25th, 1969, in Hanover, West Germany. Positioned at the Hanover airport was a small regional jet, owned and operated by the German carrier LTU. The aircraft, a Fokker 28 Fellowship like its aforementioned successor, is a rear-mounted twin-engine regional jet, suitable for short regional flights. Earlier that day, this aircraft had flown in from Dusseldorf without issue, and was scheduled to fly back. However, severe winter weather thwarted the schedule, delaying the flight for hours. This meant the aircraft, with its passengers, stayed on the ground. 1969 was the introduction year of the Fokker 28, making this particular plane one of the first manufactured units. In fact, it was so new that this plane still wore a Dutch registration. Papa Hotel Zulu Alpha Alpha was actually a Fokker 28 prototype that had been delivered to LTU ahead of the plane's official introduction, which would come a month later. This flight was a demonstration flight performed to help crews get used to the plane ahead of it going into regular service. With temperatures hovering around freezing, there had been significant snowfall, some of which began to accumulate on the plane's surfaces, including the wings. De-icing equipment had been positioned by the aircraft, however, continuous snowfall meant that icy conditions persisted, even after the plane was de-iced. During the time the plane spent on the ground, the flight crew consisting of 2 captains, a Captain Kraus and Captain Weber, no first names available, they met with other pilots, and given the nature of the flight, this was more of an evaluation flight with 2 further first officers observing for a total of 4 flight crew members on board. In fact, only 11 people would be on the flight. It was not until about 4:30 p.m. that the Fokker 28 would head back out to the runway for its return flight, having spent some 5 hours in snowfall. Though a walk-around of the aircraft did reveal patches of ice on the wings, the flight crew determined that it shouldn't have been enough to pose a threat, so they returned to the flight deck and prepared for departure. The plane built speed, making its way down the runway in Hanover, and once reaching the VR rotation speed, which was calculated to be around 110 knots on this occasion, the pilot flying lifted the plane into the air at an angle of around 12 degrees. The plane was estimated to be only about 15 meters in the air when suddenly the wings began to stall with uncommanded bank. First to the right with a bank angle of 25 degrees for 5 seconds. To correct this, the pilot attempted to deflect the ailerons in the opposite direction, with seemingly little response. But then, the plane ferociously banked in the opposite direction, the roll axis rapidly translating through the neutral position to 30 degrees of bank to the left. That's a swing of 55 degrees. Because of these sudden oscillations, the aircraft had lost speed and altitude, pushing the plane towards a stall. Those warnings signaled to the pilots, indicating the aircraft was at the precipice of a loss of lift. As the plane barely had any altitude, one of the wingtips struck the ground. However, the pilots were actually able to abort the takeoff, and even managed to put the plane back down on the ground, albeit in a wounded state. They landed the aircraft on the snowy grass beside the runway, where the plane came to a stop. The plane may have suffered some damage, however the passengers swiftly evacuated, and there were no fatalities. There were many questions to be had when investigators arrived at the scene. It was urgent that the cause of this accident was identified, as this was a then brand new plane. So, what did investigators find? Well, they found a severe degradation in lift performance from the wings, induced by icing. Investigators found that though de-icing of the plane occurred, significant time had passed between the de-icing and the takeoff attempt, allowing for new ice to build. Inevitably, ice buildup on the wings was observed in the aftermath, marking the first recorded incident to involve icing on the Fokker wings. Over-rotation of the aircraft was also found to be a factor in how this plane behaved. The pilot flying had angled the plane into the air at about 12 degrees, whereas the Fokker manual suggests a rotation angle of 5 to 10 degrees. In light of this incident, Fokker took it upon themselves to run further testing throughout 1969, where wind tunnel testing revealed that the wings of the F-28 were sensitive to even trace amounts of frost and ice contamination. Fokker issued a report on the matter, emphasizing how important it is that these planes are de-iced. Either way, the incident went down as a footnote in Fokker's history, and the aviation world moved on. The reconstruction of this incident in this video was made with the help of the writings of Captain Kraus. He took the time to recount the events of that day and published a report as how he saw it. I have it right here. What happened on that distant day in 1969 would be referenced in accident reports for decades to come. 40 years later, in 2009, in a notice from the European Aviation Safety Agency, it was recommended that a particular type of plane from the same manufacturer as the aircraft involved in the Hanover case have their onboard ice protection equipment be replaced. This was following the crash of Air France Régional Flight 7775, which occurred in 2007. That accident involved a Fokker 100, the same aircraft that would later be of incident in Kazakhstan in 2019. 15 years preceding the Air France accident, the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States also issued a mandate with regards to icing of the Fokker 100's older sister, the Fokker 28. This was on recommendation from the National Transportation Safety Board following the crash of a Fokker 28 which occurred at New York's LaGuardia Airport in March of 1992. But as it turned out, Canadian air accident investigators were also intrigued by the accident at LaGuardia, as it seemed to mirror a 1989 accident at Dryden Airport in Ontario. involving the same plane, the Fokker 28. An intriguing pattern begins to emerge here. Fokker jets crashing continuously over the decades because of ice. Looking deeper into the Canadian report, we can find more related incidents, such as that of Turkish Airlines Flight 301. Flight 301 was another Fokker 28 that had crashed in Izmir, Turkey in 1974. In a remarkably similar occurrence to the LTU Hanover case 5 years previously, the plane barely left the ground and experienced massive oscillations of the wings. At a height of no more than 30 feet, the plane stalled. However, in an unfortunate twist, they weren't so lucky. The plane crashed, killing 67 people. Investigators found, again in similarity to Hanover, that ice accumulation on the wings, coupled with over-rotation, was causal in the accident. What we want to know is why. All of these incidents would later be cited again following the crash of Palair Macedonian Airlines Flight 301. Yeah, there's 2 accidents here with the same flight number. This accident turned out to be the second deadliest air disaster to involve a Fokker plane, which crashed at Skopje in North Macedonia in March of 1993. That plane was a newer Fokker 100. The culprit in that plane crash was again ice, but also seemed to eerily resemble the other noted incidents, even though this was a new plane. The same incidents are noted again in the later Air France report. This whole string of accidents, when looked at together, paints a very compelling narrative that we'll explore today. So, is there something going on with this family of planes that leaves them with increased sensitivity to ice? If so, what is it? What's going on? Today we're going to talk about ice, what it is, well, you know what ice is, you don't need me to tell you. We're going to talk about ice, why it's a problem for airplanes, what relationship ice has with Fokker planes, and then we're going to look at some case study incidents and see if we can establish the distinguishing factors in each case. Maybe we'll learn a few interesting things along the way. However, before we get there, we should probably meet the Fokkers. The airplane manufacturer, Fokker, originated in the Netherlands and had been around for many years before they entered into the civilian market as a mainstay in the post-war jet age. The company itself dates all the way back to the 1910s, during the advent of passenger air travel. Post-World War II, Fokker produced upwards of over 1,000 passenger planes across 5 notable models, which can be designated into one of 2 designs, their turboprops and their jets. The list of aircraft in this context includes the Fokker 27, the Fokker 28, Fokker 50, Fokker 100, and Fokker 70, their last plane. The 27 and 50 models were turboprops and, interestingly, never had the same icing issues. In fact, at a quick glance, it would appear there has never been a fatal icing-related incident involving either of these 2 planes, but that's beside the point. First flying in 1955, the Fokker 27 was a slower turboprop, but it was very much a popular plane for its time. The later Fokker 50 was effectively a modernized Fokker 27 built in the 1980s with some changes. This detail of the manufacturer remaking their plane for a more modern time would carry over into their jet range of planes. This is also not something exclusive to Fokker. Perhaps we can look towards Boeing, who have continuously updated their 737 model since 1967, adapting it for newer modern technology, but we've already talked about that. Twice. But with that in mind, we should take a closer look at Fokker's jet planes, and we need to talk about the Fokker 28. The Fokker 28, nicknamed the Fellowship, first took flight in 1967. Fokker had correctly identified that airlines were looking for smaller jet planes to fill a gap in the market that had reared itself in the dawn of the jet age. Planes like the DC-8, 707, and even the 727 were generally too big for regional routes, so the race was on, as several aircraft manufacturers took a stab at making their own regional jet and claiming a slice of that sweet lucrative aviation pie. If a manufacturer could secure their position... I'm going to put this down. Okay. If a manufacturer could secure their position in the market, it could be a good long-term business if it takes off. Pun fully intended. So in 1969, Fokker finally introduced the Fokker 28 Fellowship. With a 20-year-long production run up to 1987, 241 of these planes were produced across 4 main variants. One operator of the type was an old, long-defunct Swedish airline called Linjeflyg. Is that how you say it? This airline, along with Brathens in neighbouring Norway, was able to operate all 20 of their Fokker 28s in Scandinavia, where winters are known to be severe enough to warrant regular de-icing of aircraft. And they didn't have any of them crash because of it. This tells us, simply, that there is nothing intrinsically unsafe about operating these planes in such conditions. They do, however, need to be properly looked after. Looking at the Fokker 28, the plane features a typical regional jet design, with 2 rear-mounted engines with the horizontal stabilizer connected to the top of the tail fin. This design is often referred to as the T-tail. In fact, it looks very similar to 2 other planes of this time period, the British BAC-111 and the American Douglas DC-9, both of which were direct competitors to the Fokker 28. The general shape and design of the Fokker 28, including the engine placement and, more notably, the profile of the wings, would become the baseline for when its modern derivatives, the Fokker 170, would be produced. In the context of our Fokker Enigma, the wings are of very high interest for reasons we are about to discuss, which inevitably brings us to asking a simple question. I think most of us have a pretty good idea as to why ice is a bad thing if you are an airplane. However, to make sure that we cover all bases, let's explore why ice is a threat to aircraft in the first place. Aeroplanes achieve flight due to a force called lift, which I'm pretty sure isn't news to literally anyone watching this video. Lift is a pretty complex topic to unpack, and it's also something that people disagree on in different ways, so I'm going to do my best to provide you with a simple enough understanding of it, to provide you with all of the information necessary to tackle the deeper layers of this video. So this is going to require an introductory, if brief, lesson on the principles of flight. Here comes the airplane. No, can't put that in the video. As a plane flies through the air, there are 4 forces that need to be met in balance for stable flight. Thrust is the forward force, achieved thanks to the engines. Drag is the aft force. Weight is the downward force. And finally, the main topic for us here is the upward force, known as lift. These 4 forces are kept in balance when a plane is in stable flight. They can change if a plane is climbing, descending, turning, but regardless of that, these forces are still here. With that, we'll unpack lift in a bit more detail. At the end of the day, lift will only pick a plane up off the ground if there is enough lift energy to offset the plane's own weight. The same forces which allow an aircraft to fly are the same as it is with birds, and as with birds, the key to achieving flight is obviously in the wings. This is why propulsion is needed, to get air to interact with the wings. The easiest way to visualize the lifting force in action is to look at a cross-sectional diagram of a wing. Wings are actually pretty curvy when looked at this way. They are designed this way on purpose to exploit the quirk of nature that allows planes to take to the skies. Here's a few quick technical terms you might want to bear in mind. Firstly, the mean average geometrical line between the upper and lower surfaces running through the wing is known as the camber line, and varies depending on the wing shape. It can also change with the extension of trailing and leading edge flaps. The chord line is the line driven directly from the leading edge of the wing straight through to the trailing edge. The angle between the chord line of the wing and that of the oncoming airflow is known as the angle of attack. The lifting effect is achieved by an effective redirection of airflow. This is where the shape of the wing is important. Air hits a wing head-on and is smoothly redirected thanks to the curvy nature of the wing. This is known as the Coanda effect, that being the tendency for fluids, which also includes airflow, to cling to curved surfaces. In relation to a wing, this flowing air can create some pressure stresses, a region of higher pressure underneath the wing related to the higher density caused by an increase in air molecules, and the low pressure region above the wing. Depending on who you ask, they may even argue that this pressure differential is what creates lift, and it is true that these pressure stresses are here, but this does not account for this change in the direction of airflow. Airflow interacting with the wing will accelerate smoothly around it, where it leaves the wing fast, angled downward, producing a force that pushes the wing up. Hey, that's what lift is. We could even do that thing where you blow over a piece of paper. We have the air flowing over it that is redirected because of the Coanda effect, and this lifts it up. So because of this, I always try to imagine it like the plane pushing itself off the ground. You can feel the lifting force yourself if you have ever stuck your arm out of a moving car flatly and twisted your hand to simulate an airplane wing. It's the same sort of idea, just imagine that force on a far greater scale. That's how an airplane flies. The Coanda effect, by the way, was named after Henry Coanda, the Romanian engineer, and they even named the airport in Bucharest after him. How cute! We can look even deeper when discussing lift and take a more mathematical spin. Look, I had this drilled into my head in flying school, and I'll be damned if I let it go to waste, so you have to hear it too. When discussing aerodynamics, scientists, engineers, and pilots use various different mathematical formulas when it comes to the physics of it all. For lift, there is a specific formula which is taught to pilots on day one of flying school when discussing the principles of flight. This is the lift equation. It states that lift is equal to coefficient of lift times half air density times velocity to the power of 2 multiplied by surface area. All of these variables relate to the properties of a plane's wing. The numerical operations are simple enough to understand, so let us break down the different variables and what they mean, beginning with lift coefficient. This includes the aforementioned angle of attack, the way in which the plane is flying through the air relative to the oncoming airflow. It also includes the wing profile, the physical shape of the wing itself, and the viscosity of the air. Now, air viscosity in and of itself is a highly complex subject that is far beyond the scope of this video, and my own intellect. Changing the angle of attack can manipulate a plane's lift coefficient. Pitching the nose up can drastically increase a plane's lift, but only up until a certain point, the critical stall moment where air can no longer flow over the wings as needed. The next part of the equation relates to air density, represented here by the 17th letter of the Greek alphabet, rho. Air density and pressure is greater at ground level than at higher altitudes. Therefore, the properties of lift vary greatly depending on altitude. Assuming the same airspeed and pitch or whatever, your plane will generate more lift at lower altitudes than higher altitudes. There are more air molecules for the wings to interact with. Air density is then multiplied by velocity to the power of 2, or squared. This is pretty self-explanatory and relates to the speed of the aircraft and thus the speed of the wing. These values are then divided by 2 to get the final value which is represented here. And of course we can't forget the other piece of the lift equation here, the surface area of the wing. All of these variables are put together in this way to achieve a final value. The final output value of the lift equation is nearly always within a limit for safe flight. Should this value go out of limits, then a plane may be in a stall scenario, for example. So, with all of that, let's now discuss why significant icing can be dangerous. Firstly, ice can accumulate on an aircraft in a number of different ways. Water, moisture, freezing creating sheets of ice, snow simply falling and accumulating, or heaven forbid, you get the unholy hybrid of supercooled rainfall which causes raindrops to instantly freeze on contact. Because this is ice we are talking about here, it can be unpredictable in how it lays on the wings. It won't coat the surfaces evenly. To put it simply, ice disrupts that smooth airflow the wing demands, increasing drag, decreasing lift. This can cause the airflow on the wing to separate and become turbulent. Therefore, the wing is unable to complete the lift process, dampening its performance. Increased drag will also manifest in sluggish acceleration, overall leaving the wing with a lower lift output, which if this reduced output falls below what is needed to offset the weight of the aircraft, then she's going to struggle to fly. Let's think about this in the context of takeoff. A wing contaminated with ice will produce a lower amount of lift than a clear, uncontaminated wing. As the pilot raises the nose at the calculated takeoff speed, assuming their plane is clear of ice, the unevenness of the wing can cause separation of airflow when the nose is raised. The plane is at risk of a stall as airflow separation kills lift right when it is needed. Remember that over-rotation aspect? Well, this is it. The wing performance is already substantially reduced because of the ice. Pitching the nose too high is going to exacerbate that. What this means is that the pilot, thinking they are just doing a normal takeoff, assuming their wing is clean, uncontaminated, is going to bring the plane into a stall right as the wheels leave the ground, and that is basically what is happening here. This is just one side of all of this, and doesn't touch upon the specifics with the incidents themselves, and we will get to that. Now, aerodynamic stalls are actually very interesting. Airplane wings have been engineered with the idea in mind that it is preferable for the root of the wing to stall first, progressing inside out. This doesn't always happen, but it is preferable because if airflow is still present at the tips, this can offer the pilot a greater deal of control during a stall, as they may still have use of the ailerons. If a stall does occur at the tips, which can easily be the case for planes with swept wings and also be induced by icing, then this can cause control problems for this reason. We can also have a situation where one wing will stall before the other, a non-symmetrical stall, let's say. This can easily follow through into massive wing oscillations, uncommanded yaw, and bank. We saw this when we looked at what happened in Hanover. I wonder if something similar will come up later in this video. So, ice, not cool. Did I really write that? Oh my god. To mitigate these problems, the aviation industry has developed a number of technologies over the years to fight icing, not least of which may be something you're familiar with if you live somewhere with consistent snowy conditions in winter, such as Scandinavia or Canada, for example. We're talking about the means of de-icing an aircraft, the process of physically removing ice from a plane. Obviously, it should go without saying, but planes operating in snowing weather conditions should be de-iced regularly, or at least to the point that they're kept within a safe boundary. The conventional means of de-icing an aircraft involves blasting a plane with a specific mixture of glycol water, and this is de-icing fluid. This mixture is applied to a plane warm, removes ice from an aircraft, and for a short time prevents it from forming. The plane is effectively slimed in a colourful goo in a hearty display of affection from the airport. Actually, that looks like fun. Maybe I want to be de-iced. De-icing fluid takes on a number of different forms. What is known as Type 1 fluid is what you may call the standard de-icing mixture, and contains varying amounts of glycol and water. It's a diluted mixture. On its own, this fluid may still have a somewhat clear appearance, so it helps on a snowy day to be able to see it clearly. So a dye is usually added, usually red or orange. Ah, goodness me. What a mess. The degree of effectiveness that Type 1 fluid provides varies a lot on the aircraft and the sort of weather on the day. Type 1 fluid usually provides protection for about 15 minutes or so. Hi everyone, this is Future Chloe talking to you from the editing room. I just realized that I should probably clarify something real quick. So, Type 1 fluid is just that. It's applied to a plane to remove ice. The other types, Type 2 through 4, are often referred to as anti-icing fluid, as in it prevents ice from building for its prescribed holdover time. You'll even hear me say this when we talk about Type 4 in just a moment. It's minor, but I just wanted to make that distinction clear, as in general, I refer to the whole bunch in this video as de-icing fluid as a broad term. Anyway, let's get back to talking about airport juice. Type 2, 3, and 4 de-icing fluids have varying ratios on this mixture, but also contain thickeners which can stick to an aircraft, sustaining its effects for longer. Therefore, Type 2 fluid is thicker than Type 1, and became noteworthy after the accidents we are still yet to discuss in this video, because its effects last longer than Type 1. This fluid is paler in appearance. What? Type 3 de-icing fluid is similar to that of Type 2, but it's geared for a slightly different purpose. Type 3 is usually applied to planes with slower takeoff speeds, because that's how this stuff works. It's applied to an aircraft with the idea it would then shear off as the plane accelerates down the runway. However, not all planes can reach the speed of jets, so Type 3 fills that gap for slower planes as it breaks off at a slower speed. Type 3 fluid is typically coloured yellow-green. Again, Type 4 de-icing fluid is very thick, like Type 2, but features a higher concentration of glycol. I have heard some airports even refer to this as anti-icing fluid, as it can prevent ice from building for up to 2 hours. Airports will use this in combination with other types in their regular de-icing operations. And Type 4 fluid is typically coloured green. I cannot believe I let her do that to me. She talked me into it. These days, de-icing can take place almost anywhere at an airport, even by the runway thanks to the introduction of de-icing pads at certain airports, which were introduced to reduce the time between de-icing and takeoff, this being an additional measure brought in to combat the negative effects brought on by icing. However, for the longest time these weren't common, and de-icing just took place at the gate, meaning if there were delays, holdover times could expire. In-flight ice protection is a bit different. All commercial jet planes, including the Fokker jets, have built-in wing and engine anti-ice systems to try and prevent ice from accumulating at all. Hot air siphoned off from the engine air intake is directed to the wings and such to protect the plane. Sounds good, but this shouldn't really be used as a substitute for de-icing on the ground. Partly because of the Fokkers' susceptibility to icing, the final units of Fokker 100s and 70s left the production line with an on-ground heating system installed to help with ice accumulation on the leading edge. Icing here is critical in these accidents for reasons we discussed earlier and needs to be removed. Again though, it shouldn't be used as a substitute for proper de-icing. Oh gee whiz, I wonder, which system was it again that broke on the Bek Air Flight? Some planes even have what are called de-icing boots. Planes with these installed can be easily seen with their distinctive black stripes. They inflate to break away any ice that is accumulated on the leading edge of a wing or a tail fin. As aviation technology advanced, plane manufacturers have optimized their planes for peak performance and efficiency. Ice protection has also come a long way in that regard. However, though in this segment we have looked at lift, how wings create lift, how ice can disrupt it, and even developed a basic overview of how planes are de-iced, me getting de-iced in the process, this doesn't address the central theme of this video. Why did so many Fokker planes crash because of it? It took us a while to finally get here, but let's take a moment to emphasize and recognize that every plane is susceptible to icing. Every plane has this vulnerability, but not every plane is the same. There are variations in the wings and engines and so on that are going to affect each plane in different ways, and that may be where the little Fokkers stand out. Though, truth be told, no plane, whether it be a DC-9 or a Boeing 737, two planes that have had severe ice-related accidents attached to them, even they have not crashed as many times as the Fokker planes for the same reason. So, what's going on? Well, some clues can be found within the uniqueness of the Fokker wings themselves. For example, Fokker wanted to keep operation of the plane simple, so they adopted a fixed leading edge wing. What this means is that the front of the wing is, well, fixed, and can't be manipulated with lifting devices. So the Fokker 28 and its older sisters, the Fokker 100 and Fokker 70, only had trailing edge flaps. Flaps are normal and every plane has them, but it's also common for passenger planes even back in the 1960s to have leading edge flaps, often referred to as slats, lifting devices on the front of the wings that can be extended to optimize for lift. The Fokker planes never had them, aside from the odd prototype. For example, the Boeing 727, of the same era as the Fokker 28, had those leading-edge high-lift devices, and is a really good example of this difference. The selected setting for flaps and slats is taken into account in the takeoff calculations, and I'll tell you, many an air accident have been had where the flaps had not been extended, whether for mechanical reasons, pilot error, or some combination of the two. For this reason, the Fokkers, their margins for takeoff are finer. What this means is that even just a tiny amount of ice on the Fokker wings can have huge implications for their performance. As to what these implications can entail, we can find an explanation deep into the investigative report into the Air Ontario accident. Don't worry, we're getting to that one very soon. It is explained here that under contaminated conditions, planes with leading-edge lifting devices, such as a Boeing 737, have this pitch-up roll-off effect, and pilots had been able to recover and were even able to utilize extreme movements of the control wheel to overcome effects of ice contamination. A swept-wing jet with a fixed leading edge, on the other hand, like the Fokker jets, could be left in a situation where it can't achieve the same climb away, or fly out of ground effect. However, fixed leading edge or not, ice and frost contamination is going to affect any wing. One type of wing is not necessarily better than the other. Passenger planes, you'll notice, have unanimously taken on the swept wing design, this meaning the wings are angled away from the wing root. This is done for aerodynamic reasons, making for a more favourable centre of gravity, reduced drag, and greater performance at higher airspeeds. Now, the Fokker family of jets does fall into the swept wing category. In fact, the Fokker wing is of this very particular supercritical shape that aimed to reduce drag at cruise speed. They also designed the profile of the wings so they will produce a lot of lift on their own. I mean, consider the fact that the Fokker line of jets are some of the only passenger planes around that have been rated for flapless takeoffs, because the wings do such a good job of this. Doesn't stop them from being extremely sensitive to ice though. However, when it comes to swept wings and icing, some challenges present themselves because the shape of these wings opens them up to complicated variations in the roughness of ice accretion. They can build ice in seemingly unpredictable ways. It just so happens that the Fokker wing with its profile, that sweep angle with the lack of leading edge lifting devices, the wing would just lose lift with a lower amount of ice contamination compared to other planes. And the Fokker sisters, for the longest time, were some of the only jets around with this configuration. So here is the quick rundown of how ice impacts the performance of the Fokker wings according to Fokker. Significant loss of lift, increased drag that can potentially be doubled, a drop in the stall speed of up to 30 knots, which can also occur at a shallower angle of attack. The main point here is that even just a little bit of ice, millimeters even, can severely inhibit the takeoff performance of the Fokker 28. Comparatively, a plane like the Airbus A320 may be able to perform better under the same conditions, as that plane uses a different wing shape and retained those leading edge devices that promote a greater yield of lift on takeoff. Fokker themselves had known about this susceptibility. They had run many tests and simulations, making amendments in their standard procedures so the plane can conform to safety standards and fly safely in icy weather. And here's the thing. There's actually nothing wrong with it.
With frost roughness present on the upper wing surface, the characteristics of slow stall progression towards the wingtip is lost, and uncontrollable roll may develop at an angle of attack as low as 10 degrees. The drag of a clean wing is such that the aircraft is capable of climbing away at the required climb angle at V2 with one engine inoperative. In the case of a contaminated wing, the drag may however be doubled due to a wing stall which occurs at an angle of attack only slightly greater than that for stick shaker operation. Consequently, acceleration is lost, even with all engines operating at takeoff power.
Fokker had issued guidance which subsequently made its way into operators' manuals, which clearly states this problem. Ice, even just a little bit of it, can severely impair the lift performance of the Fokker 28's wings. Fokker had always been clear of that. Because of this, in winter conditions, the plane must be thoroughly de-iced before takeoff. The correct procedures need to be in place at multiple levels: pilot training, airport practices, airline policy, and so on. The Fokker 28 and its younger sisters can fly in icy weather. They just need to be appropriately looked after in such conditions. And when there is a breakdown of standards, that's when problems begin to occur with the Fokkers. So, are all of these accidents connected? Well, sort of. You see, though Fokker planes have a recorded history with ice, it's not the ice on its own that causes these accidents. To be blunt, you can fly a Fokker 28 in snowy weather. To be absolutely clear, everything we're talking about today could be avoided by following basic procedures. It's ice compounding against other factors, whether that be over-rotation or a lack of de-icing or both, or something else entirely, and I hope that is going to become clearer as we take a look at some of these accidents. Right. With that said, I think it's time we took a look at the accident that really brought this to the forefront of aviation safety. An accident so stunning that it serves as a reminder to us, even today, as to just how lethal ice can be. I'm talking about Air Ontario Flight 1363.
By the 1980s, Fokker 28s, which had been in service for a number of years with major carriers in Europe, were now being passed on and sold on to other airlines, often smaller regional carriers. This brings us to Canada, where in 1983, a new but growing regional airline by the name of Air Ontario got their footing. In early 1988, the Toronto-based airline acquired two Fokker 28s of the first 1000 model variant. The date was March 10, 1989. One Air Ontario Fokker 28 was making a trip between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg as Air Ontario Flight 1363. It was the return flight of that day. However, the aircraft needed to make a stop in between Winnipeg and Thunder Bay in the small town of Dryden for refueling. Such a refueling stop was not normally needed. The Fokker 28 can fly this distance easily on a single tank of fuel. However, there was a heavy load of passengers, induced in part because of school holidays, manifesting in a large number of family vacationers making their way to ski resorts in the west. As a byproduct of that, the plane was also carrying a lot of passenger luggage. This meant the plane was quite heavy for such a small jet, which had some implications for the fuel situation. Regulations required the pilots to take on enough fuel for the trip, but also enough to make it to their alternate airport, plus more for contingency. Because of the poor weather on the day, the flight plan called for an alternate a greater distance away from their destination. In fact, the filed alternate was even further away than Thunder Bay at Sault Ste. Marie. It's unusual, and this wouldn't normally be the alternative for a flight like this, but the weather facilitated it. Flight 1363 would have to carry enough fuel for the trip to Winnipeg, enough for the alternate, plus a little extra, making the stopover in Dryden necessary in order to keep the plane within safe weight limits. Though the aircraft arrived in Dryden without incident, this configuration of the weight would have an interesting knock-on effect as the morning progressed. March 10, 1989 was a very bad day for this particular Fokker 28. The weather was abysmal with heavy snowfall in the area. The weather alone was not the main factor in the outcome of the accident. There are many contributing factors that led to disaster, but all compounded against the Fokker 28's susceptibility to ice. In the accident plane's twilight days before March 10th, its auxiliary power unit, or APU, was inoperative. For Air Ontario, they couldn't source the necessary parts to fix the APU right away, so maintenance was deferred. Regardless, the airline dispatched the plane with the thing broken. The APU can perform numerous functions on an airplane. It's basically a small jet that powers a generator providing electrical power and hot air to various systems throughout the plane. With the APU running, the plane can be powered independently without the need to have its main engines running, or with the help of a ground power supply. It borrows a small amount of fuel in the process. The APU is located at the very rear of the plane, mounted within the tail structure, and if you have ever boarded a plane via the stairs, you may recognize the APU running from the loud noise that seemingly emanates from the plane. You know the one. This one. Because of the APU's nature of being an engine, it is also used to start up a plane's main engines from its air supply. The APU is normally how pilots start up the engines on passenger planes. However, in the case of this plane, because the APU was non-functional, the plane got its engines running in Winnipeg at the start of the day with the help of a ground air supply. But critically, such equipment was not present in Thunder Bay or Dryden. This left the aircraft in a rather awkward predicament. They couldn't start the engines on their own with their APU, and they couldn't start the engines with the help from equipment at the smaller airport. So what did they do to navigate this problem? They simply kept one engine running on the ground at all times, specifically engine number 2 on the right side. In other words, when the plane parked on the stand, the pilots only shut down one engine. This was a problem that persisted throughout the day, and if it shut down, they'd be stranded, the flight cancelled, and money would have to be fronted for hotel and travel expenses for dozens of passengers and crew. For the pilots themselves, this was frustrating, as you can imagine. Due to internal disputes at the airline stemming from labor union disputes and pilot strikes, the airline struggled to find any flight crew with substantial experience on the Fokker 28. All of Air Ontario's Fokker pilots were still new to the plane and only joined the fleet recently, so let's meet the flight crew of Flight 1363. 51-year-old Captain George Morwood was a highly experienced pilot with an extensive career not just at Air Ontario but also with one of its predecessor carriers, Great Lakes Airlines. His total flying experience amounted to over 24,000 flight hours across a career spanning 3 decades. However, as we have already established, he was still new to the Fokker 28 at Air Ontario. His previous flight experience was in older Convair piston propliners. He had jumped to the Fokker jet just 2 months before the accident, with just 81 hours logged in the type. To his right was 35-year-old First Officer Keith Mills. As a much younger member of crew, his flying career was obviously not as extensive, but he was no slouch in his job, though he had even less experience in the Fokker 28 than the captain, with just 65 hours logged in the type. In the cabin were 65 passengers and a further 2 flight attendants, with one Catherine Say sitting in the front and Sonia Hartwick who was sitting further aft, specifically in seat 8D, an emergency exit row. She would go on to be the only surviving member of crew, and her extensive testimony, among others from passengers, later proved to be invaluable to investigators, as the plane's flight recorders would not survive the crash and subsequent fire. Sonia, before departure, reported looking out through a window to see there was a layer of fluffy snow on the wing, to use her own words. The Fokker 28-1000 could seat 65 passengers. However, one seat would remain unoccupied as the 65th passenger was an infant who sat with a parent. This allowed Hartwick to take seat in 8D instead of at the usual station in the aft of the cabin. There was also another unusual passenger on the flight. A prisoner, escorted by Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was in transit to a detention centre. They were placed in handcuffs for the journey. Problems with this flight were not just limited to the non-functional APU. Once the plane left Winnipeg that morning for the outbound flight to Thunder Bay, a series of other issues had reared themselves that would each play a small role in the final outcome of the incident. When the plane arrived in Thunder Bay earlier that morning, the day's schedule began to drift. Instead of boarding the expected number of passengers in Thunder Bay, the airline forced the crew of Flight 1363 to take on 10 additional passengers, which had come from a cancelled flight. This had a rather interesting effect on the schedule. You see, the plane was loaded within its safe limits for takeoff with the number of passengers and bags they were expecting. The addition of new passengers brought the plane beyond this limit and would otherwise be overweight, this manifesting in the awkward fuel situation. Therefore, in Thunder Bay, the pilots elected to offload some fuel, with the idea that they would then reload that fuel into the tanks in Dryden for the final leg to Winnipeg. Flight 1363 was delayed for some time, but when they arrived in Dryden, this meant further delay to refuel, in the snowfall. The refueling process in Dryden also perplexed investigators. Because they couldn't shut down both engines, this meant they performed what is known in the industry as a hot refuel, where the plane is refueled with an engine running. It is not a common practice, but it is something that can be done and was allowed. During the stopover, the pilots, at least at first, stayed on the flight deck. These delays were something that was weighing on the minds of the crew, even the cabin crew who had to face customers with expected connections in Winnipeg. At some point, the first officer left the cockpit to use the restroom, and during this time, Captain Morwood, we can only speculate, continued to think about these delays, because upon the first officer's return, Captain Morwood took the opportunity to leave the plane, where he re-entered the terminal. Eyewitness accounts on the day report that he made his way to the Air Ontario office, picked up the phone, and called Air Ontario's operations, where he proceeded to complain about the situation. When he was finished, the captain appeared visibly frustrated. Captain Morwood was the type of pilot who prided himself on punctuality, but at the same time was never known to compromise the safety of his passengers. He was under a lot of pressure, stressed to get the plane moving. Obviously, something had gone wrong here, as the captain had delayed flights because of ice and snowy conditions before. Now, because the captain sadly did not survive the accident, we can only speculate with a certain degree of plausibility that though Captain Morwood may well have been aware of the icing situation regarding his aircraft and knew that de-icing was available in Dryden, he could have been simply mistaken in a belief that snow on the plane would blow away on takeoff, as to not impair the plane's performance in the way it ultimately did.
What we are saying here is that in all of the chaos that unfolded on the ground in Dryden, with the continuous delays and the need to hot refuel, the plane just wasn't de-iced before departure. Even a small regional airport like the one in Dryden has the equipment to de-ice a plane, but it never happened that day to Flight 1363. However, a clue as to why de-icing never happened on this occasion can be found in Air Ontario's policies, which stipulated that no de-icing should take place at all whilst either of the engines are running. Because Air Ontario had chosen to dispatch the plane with a broken APU, forcing the pilots to keep one engine running the entire time, they also couldn't de-ice the plane and conform with this policy, which, to be blunt, was probably there for good reason. Okay, so let me explain. To a certain extent, a little bit of de-icing fluid can get into the engines and won't cause problems. It's almost inevitable when you're spraying an aircraft down. Traces of it are going to get into the inlet, which may result in a distinctive odor in the cabin. For a number of reasons though, you still don't really want the engines to ingest a lot of this stuff. It can be corrosive, it can be flammable, but de-icing fluid can also be toxic, with varying levels of toxicity based on fluid type. Because the engines are where they are on the Fokker 28, it can be very easy for the engines to intake a lot of this fluid if this were to happen. That could then make its way into the cabin, which wouldn't be good for obvious reasons. You don't want to spray the air your passengers are breathing with toxic antifreeze. This is why the engines were required to be shut down for de-icing, hence this policy, and this is the reason Captain Morwood probably didn't de-ice the plane, because he couldn't. After spending around 30 minutes in continuous snowfall, a layer of ice had accumulated on the wings. It wouldn't have been easy to see under the fluffy layer of snow that flight attendant Sonia Hartwig described. The ice would stay there because no de-icing occurred. The pilots may not have had a clear view of it either from their window, or from their position on the ground. Even if the plane had been de-iced, there was another underlying condition that would have promoted ice accumulation on the wings between the gate and takeoff, and it's to do with the actual temperature of the wings themselves. Try to imagine for just a moment when you've been outside and it's snowing. You notice that snowflakes upon contact with your skin melt instantly. Obviously, this is because your body is much warmer than that of the outside air. But try to imagine now if you were an airplane made of metal that has just descended from the absolute frigid temperatures of high altitude. You see, the fuel in the tanks can become chilled well below freezing temperature. This comes not just from the cold outside temperatures in winter, but also from those frigid temperatures at high altitude. Kerosene's freezing point, in fact, is around negative 30 degrees Celsius, so on a day like March 10th, 1989, the wings themselves could have been freezing with a temperature much lower than that of the actual outside air temperature, which hovered around zero. This is known as cold soaking. The wings were soaked in the cold, and stayed well below freezing whilst on the ground. Simply put, cold soaking in snowfall can enable a small amount of ice to quickly accumulate on the wings, as droplets instantly freeze on the surface, and as we have established, even a small amount of ice can severely inhibit the lift performance of the Fokker. This may also have been something the captain was unfamiliar with, which may have misled him into believing that his plane was still okay. Let's just put a pin in this for later. This cold soaking effect would have played a role in other Fokker disasters. One notable major incident we will talk about later in this video. Eventually, Air Ontario Flight 1363 was cleared for departure, and taxied out to runway 29. Then, rather frustratingly, another delay reared itself. Just moments before Flight 1363 was about to enter the active runway, the pilot of a small Cessna plane gets on frequency. Weather had been deteriorating at Dryden, and sensing an urgent situation, the pilot of this light aircraft sought to land immediately. The pilot had even identified whiteout conditions. Captain Morwood had no choice but to stay put on the ground, holding position on the taxiway. Flight 1363 was left waiting for the arrival of this plane in the snow. This delay lasted about 3 minutes, at which point Flight 1363 finally entered the runway and the plane had to backtrack into position. From the pilot's POV, everything up till this point was working as normal. Captain Morwood fires up the Fokker 28's 2 Rolls-Royce Spey engines and the plane begins to accelerate down the runway.
Sonia Hartwick, sitting in seat 8D, looks out of the window and notices that as the plane accelerated, the snow on the wings was blown away to reveal a hardened sheet of ice covering the wings. The pilots are unaware of its presence. As the speed increases, the pilots would have been monitoring their instruments on the flight deck. Everything continued to progress as normal, until they reached the rotation speed. Captain Morwood begins pulling back on the control wheel, bringing the nose of the plane into the air. And then, Flight 1363 struggles to climb, the wings oscillating. Because of the ice on the wings, there is too little lift being generated. Airflow has been disrupted over the wings, causing separation of said airflow. There is not enough lift energy to overcome the ground effect and achieve a safe climb away. As a result, the plane struggles down the runway, barely lifting off the ground. Captain Morwood wrestles with the aircraft, but it's no use. The plane stalls and drops into the trees beyond the end of the runway. The plane was pulled below the tree line, where it began to break apart. Flight 1363 crashed just seconds after leaving the runway, killing 24 people, including the 2 pilots.
The investigation into Air Ontario Flight 1363 was extensive, with the final report coming in at a total of over 1,800 pages, with the inquiry led by Canadian Justice Virgil Mashansky covering all bases. The work in this report is stellar, and became a cornerstone of research into the effects of icing on aircraft. The report contains a number of safety recommendations that highlight the Fokker 28's susceptibility to ice and emphasizes compliance with procedures that ensures that something like this doesn't happen. Like, just so we are all on the same page here, they had figured out in this investigation why this plane behaved the way it did. They looked at everything from the operational standpoint with the airline to analysing the performance of the wings and the lift dampening properties brought on by snow and ice that day, and they even worked with Fokker to outline the measures needed to keep this plane safe. But, we are, sadly, only halfway through this video. To bang out some of the highlights, among the recommendations outlined in the report was for de-icing facilities to be located near the runway in addition to the gate. It recommends that airports keep stock of Type 2 fluid to increase holdover times, and it also recommends that pilots thoroughly check the icing status of the wings, either through a tactile test, as in physically feeling the top of the wing surface, or through checking the passenger windows. The report and its recommendations and warnings should have made its way to aviation authorities around the world, especially regions which get cold weather. So, were the warnings outlined in this report heeded? No?
March 22nd, 1992. It's a very cold evening at New York's LaGuardia Airport. In fact, the weather is poor and flights are facing cancellations and delays. USAir Flight 405 is one of those flights. The plane, a Fokker 28, had already been delayed on its inbound flight due to the weather in New York being so poor. When the plane arrived on stand at LaGuardia, the captain put in an order to have the plane de-iced. The pilots then left the plane for a short moment to use the restroom in the terminal, but returned around 10 minutes later. When they did return, 2 de-icing trucks had arrived on stand and started blasting the aircraft with the glycol water mixture. Let's meet the crew of this flight. 44-year-old Wallace Major was a former military man turned commercial pilot. He joined commercial aviation in 1985, which was when he began working on the Fokker. Achieving nearly 10,000 hours across his whole career, he was considered to be a very cautious pilot. He was working that evening with the 30-year-old first officer, one John Rashuba. The younger first officer was much less experienced, but had 4,500 flight hours behind him by the time of the accident, just 29 of which were in this aircraft, so he was very new to the Fokker. Prior to the departure of USAir Flight 405, you would expect that a walk-around would be performed. It is a standard procedure that is common for pilots to do before they head out. However, USAir did not require their pilots to actually do this, and it just so happened to be the case that neither of the pilots would do a walk-around of the aircraft before it left the gate. The time was 8:30 in the evening. The flight was already an hour behind schedule getting into the airport, but further delays came when one of the de-icing trucks that had just been servicing the plane broke down, boxing the plane into its gate.
This resulted in an additional 20-minute delay. In that time, the captain, correctly, must have determined that the effects of de-icing were wearing off, and thus requested a second de-icing. How this was done was the plane was pushed back from the gate, the de-icing trucks serviced the plane before the engines were started. The process was completed at 9 p.m. on the hour. Finally, USAir 405 leaves the gate and begins to taxi out to runway 13. At LaGuardia Airport, that is the runway that leads out into Flushing Bay. This taxi would be anything but smooth and orderly, however. In fact, the plane would still be on the ground for at least 35 minutes before they got into position on the runway. The airport was busy, and the plane was queued up behind several others, so the plane sat, nudging its way across the airport in snowfall. Now, a Northwest Airlines Boeing 757 was queued up behind the Fokker 28. This pilot had a good view of the plane's wings, not only from being behind them, but also from the higher vantage point the Boeing 757 allows for. He would later comment to investigators that he could see snowy fuzz on the airplane, and he continued to add that it appeared that the wings were clear of snow, but they could not comment if they saw ice buildup on the wings. This comment about the reduced snowfall at this time is very interesting because, yes, the snow would soon begin to settle. Therefore, if we do assume no ice on the wings at this point, this will serve to remind us just how quickly this can change without the necessary de-icing. Another pilot would come forward with a similar observation. One of the pilots of a Trump shuttle Boeing 727 had also spoken to investigators. They were holding at one taxiway whilst the Fokker 28 crossed over. They noted that the plane looked clear of snow on the wings and fuselage, but also could not determine the status of ice on the wings. It turns out this sort of thing is actually really hard to spot in an airport environment, especially at night in poor weather with all of the reflections from all of the lights. Back on the flight deck of Flight 405, the pilots progressed through their pre-takeoff checks. The surviving first officer would later recall to investigators just what happened in the cockpit during this time. The engine anti-ice was switched on, which then directed attention to the wings. Now, to help with this whole ice detection thing, there was this black strip that was added to the leading edge of some Fokker jets. It was in a position that pilots just about had a view of it from the cockpit, though pilots would have to lean to see it. The black strip would contrast nicely with ice, giving a quick indication of icing status. Peering out of the window, the first officer recalled how it appeared there was no ice on the leading edge, on this black strip. The crew even selected and switched on an additional external inspection light to get a better look at this section of the wing, this being something that the pilot of the Trump shuttle aircraft also noticed them using. Still, they determined that the wing looked clear of ice from their position. This was a method that was common among Fokker pilots at USAir. Fokker 28 pilots in general had this tendency to believe they could determine the state of ice contamination from the cockpit. Though they could enter the cabin and observe the wings from the passenger windows, many believed that they didn't need to because they could see part of the wing from the cockpit. Investigators, however, were of the opinion that it would have been very difficult to gauge this information in this way, going on to say that the black strip was more useful for detecting ice in flight. This is to say, the wings of USAir Flight 405 were, in actuality, covered in a sheet of ice as the effects of the Type 1 de-icing fluid had worn off. It's 9:33. By this point, the snowfall began to settle. Despite the fact it had been over half an hour since the plane was last de-iced, the crew of Flight 405 did not request another. However, if we think about this for a moment, if the flight crew wanted further de-icing, this would mean leaving the queue of planes and heading all the way back to the apron to be de-iced, only to then have to rejoin the queue again. Not that this changes things much, but this is a symptom of airport congestion and the broader consequences it can inflict. You can see now why de-icing pads would become necessary at some airports. USAir 405 was cleared to enter the runway and the takeoff progressed, seemingly normal at first. The Fokker jet continued to accelerate towards the takeoff speed of 124 knots. However, this could be the moment where everything went wrong. Or rather, this could be the moment that the plane was pushed beyond its limits. When the rotation call-out was made, the captain pulled back on the control wheel. The thing is, they weren't quite at the takeoff speed yet.
The nose was raised just a little too early. The takeoff speed was 124 knots. The investigation found that they attempted the takeoff at a speed of 119. So not only were the wings contaminated with ice, but in addition to that, the plane now had to do the takeoff without the required airspeed. The stage for a post-takeoff stall was set. As the stall warning inevitably sounds, the plane banks to the left. The captain tries to level the wings and keep the plane stable, but just seconds after leaving the ground, the plane stalls again and the left wing makes contact with the ground. The plane is seemingly out of control as the plane banks sharply to the right, then back to the left, this time exiting the runway skewed to the left. Going off the runway, the plane strikes some runway lights, followed by the pump house parallel to the end of the runway, before then also destroying an ILS localizer antenna. Unable to properly lift off, Flight 405 leaves the runway structure, banks, and crashes into Flushing Bay, partially inverted. Of the 51 people on board, the crash kills 27, including the captain. Okay, so yeah, this was something that airlines, airports, and pilots of the Fokker 28 had to make sure they fully understood when it came to the icing practices of the plane. Now, Canadian air accident investigators looked on in bemusement, puzzled as to why the Dryden accident had basically happened again after they had already issued recommendations to prevent this exact thing from happening. So, what happened? To be honest, I am uncertain as to what exactly happened. It's all a bit fuzzy, and it is a bit of a messy situation, really. Canadian authorities claimed they did send the report to the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, but then some at the FAA claimed they hadn't received it, blaming Canadian government bureaucracy, and then some say that they did have it, but it just got shoved in a drawer or something. Look, there's a lot of finger-pointing here that probably isn't helpful to argue about over 30 years later. I do want to share this real quick though, as it's indicative of this breakdown of communication. It is common in these investigative reports into air disasters to reference older incidents that may be related to the one being investigated. Makes sense, right? Sounds like that would be something worth including. Would you believe me if I told you the report into USAir 405 doesn't do that? Like, there is nowhere in this report that references the other Fokker 28 incidents, including the Air Ontario case this accident so closely resembles. Regardless of communications, fact is, safety recommendations issued by the Canadians had not been implemented, at least at LaGuardia Airport. If they had, Type 2 fluid may have been in use, and the accident aircraft may have been de-iced again before its takeoff attempt, meaning this whole thing might not have happened. The crash of both of these planes sparked discussion in the aviation industry on how to improve icing practices. Earlier in the video, we talked about the different types of de-icing and anti-icing fluid. Up till this point, Type 1 fluid was used frequently in airports, but calls for more frequent use of Type 2 than Type 3 and 4 fluid were brought forward. Type 4's ability to stick to an aircraft with its anti-icing properties was remarkable, and is still in common use to this day. One of the contributing factors as to why USAir 405 happened was due to LaGuardia Airport's nighttime restriction on Type 2 fluid, which was birthed out of a belief that the fluid could cause damage to the runways, leading to degradation of runway friction. However, other airports that had Type 2 in use reported no impact on runway performance. In regions of colder climates, those de-icing pads began to appear at airports. These changes aligned themselves nicely with the Air Ontario recommendations, which called for de-icing facilities to be located closer to the departure point. De-icing pads allow planes to drop in for a quick squirt before then getting on their way. There is that old saying along the lines of, "Every plane crash helps make flying a little bit safer," or something like that. And because of what happened with the Fokker 28, the aviation industry has made winter flying much safer with regards to icing operations. And you needn't worry when you arrive at the airport and it's snowing. We know what went wrong here. It should also be said, USAir 405 was the last time a Fokker 28 had to crash because of lift dampening ice on the wings. But the Fokker 28 is but one airplane. Remember, there were other Fokkers in the family.
In the 1980s, Fokker sought to redevelop the Fokker jet into what would become the Fokker 100 and Fokker 70. In a way, this was indicative of the time. I mean, they were never doing particularly great. Fokker was always constrained by their limited space at Schiphol and always needed to work with international partners. The company wasn't exactly in a position to re-engineer a plane from scratch. But there were some changes between the types, such as the longer fuselage, a modern glass cockpit, an increased wingspan, and of course those Rolls-Royce Tay engines. However, because these newer planes still borrowed so much from their older sister, like a certain other plane we've talked about previously, they inherited some of its quirks. Can you guess which ones? The Fokker 100 largely retained the same wing design and shape as its predecessor, and also didn't have leading-edge lifting devices, so basically, the same frosty wing behavior also jumped to these planes as well. It begs the question, have Fokker 100s crashed in the same way as the Fokker 28s? Yes.
Hi everyone. I would just like to preface this segment by saying that Palair Macedonian Flight 301 is an accident we have looked at in its own video before. However, that video is old, so this is going to be somewhat of a remaster, with all new recorded voiceover, new visuals, and new content and stuff, so just thought I'd let you know. It's March 5th, 1993. A Fokker jet is en route to Skopje Airport in what is known today as North Macedonia. In 1993, this was a new country, having split from the old Yugoslavia. Like any new country cementing its identity, the new Macedonia got itself a new national airline, which this plane was working for. It was known as Palair Macedonian. Getting their footing using Soviet-era planes, the company was able to acquire some of the Dutch Fokker planes, including the old Fokker 28 and the then new Fokker 100, which was what this plane was. The airline was small and operated close to the edge of financial viability, enough so that the airline was known to refuel to high capacity in regions where fuel was considerably cheaper. Frankfurt happened to have cheaper fuel that day, so they topped up there. When the plane eventually landed in Skopje though, it would still need to be refueled with enough to meet the specified requirements. Now, this really isn't all that unusual, but this seemingly unimportant aspect of the airline's operation, or rather just the refueling in general, will have an interesting role in the accident that was about to come. The plane left Frankfurt earlier that morning. It's a journey of about 2 hours. However, the plane is behind schedule. This delay of about 35 minutes is not only going to have a knock-on effect for the rest of the day's schedule, but the crew of this flight were expecting to fly the Fokker jet to Zurich afterwards, as Palair Flight 301. Their delay was about to push them beyond their duty limits. Remember when we talked about the Air Ontario accident, how we talked about the cold soaking effect? Well, the same thing was happening right now during the Frankfurt to Skopje flight. The temperature at cruising altitude was frigid, dropping the temperature of the wings, fuel tanks, and the fuel itself. Even as the plane descends towards Skopje and the temperature increases, the wings still remain frigid. Not that the temperature in Skopje was anything tropical. That day, on March 5th, 1993, the outside air temperature at ground level was about 0 degrees Celsius. The Palair Fokker 100, registered as Papa Hotel Kilo X-Ray Lima, landed in Skopje at 10:40 local time in the late morning. The inbound crew were relieved of duty as to not violate resting regulations, and a new crew was called in. The new crew was to command Palair Flight 301 to Zurich. The arrangement of the flight crew here requires a quick explanation. Palair, the airline, had leased the plane from a Dutch firm known as AFT, or Aircraft Financing and Trading. The contract meant that the Fokker plane would fly with a mixed crew comprised of one Macedonian pilot from Palair and a Dutch pilot from AFT, and both pilots were qualified captains on this occasion. In the left seat, acting as pilot in command, was AFT Captain Peter Bierdrager. This captain had over 11,000 flight hours of experience, with most of those being in Fokker aircraft. Over 1,000 hours were in the 100 model. Though he was the pilot in command, on this flight he would be PNF, Pilot Not Flying. That role was given to the individual in the right seat, the Macedonian captain. In all official reports, he is unnamed. What we do know about him is that he was Macedonian, new to the Fokker 100 with just 65 hours logged, but with over 5,000 total flight hours. He had also previously worked for the GAT Yugoslav airline. There was also an aircraft engineer on board, provided by Swissair, that the Dutch accident report refers to as a flying station engineer, or FSE. He would be occupying the jump seat in the cockpit and would fly with the plane and perform day-to-day maintenance of the aircraft. When the new crew arrived at Skopje airport, they pretty much went straight to the aircraft to prepare it for the flight to Zurich. There were a few write-ups noted in the maintenance log by the outgoing crew, which pertained to the ground proximity warning system and flap position computer. More thorough maintenance of the aircraft was carried out by Swissair in Zurich, so probably these write-ups may have been more closely looked at when the plane got there. Regardless, these are irrelevant to what actually happened. Neither of the two pilots did the walk-around. Instead, this responsibility was delegated to the flying station engineer, the FSE. He checked the exterior of the plane for any sort of faults, but did also check for ice on the wings, even performing the tactile check by physically touching the wing itself to check for ice. Supposedly, he checked the upper surface of the wing by standing on a baggage cart. Now, here is where it really gets quite interesting. It looks like the FSE only checked and based his observations on the status of the wings on the inside sections of the wings only, and did not really inspect the tips. Now, the Fokker 100 had been left in light snow conditions since it had arrived in from its previous flight. Remember, the wings had been cold-soaked. Though the plane was on the ground, the fuel in the tanks was still far below the ambient air temperature in Skopje. The fuel was around -15 degrees Celsius or so, keeping the wings very cold. This meant that falling snowflakes froze on the surface, creating patches of ice. And it's here where things get really interesting. When the refueling truck did turn up to service the plane, we have to understand that there was a great difference in temperature between the fuel still in the tanks of the Fokker jet and the fuel that was stored on the ground. The fuel in the refueling truck was considerably warmer. Fuel that was pumped into the tanks settled at the root, within the inside sections of the wings. This created a temperature gradient. We have a cold-soaked fuel tank that was introduced with warmer fuel from the truck, creating a warmer inside section of the wing where snow would begin to melt, and a freezing cold outside section at the tips. Now this really shouldn't have been much of an issue. Though when the FSE did check for ice, he and the other ground crew members they were with, they were positioned at the right wing, and they checked the inboard, warmer section of that wing for ice. The FSE would note it was slushy with melting snow, wet more or less. Slush was also picked up from the wing flaps. The conclusion? Well, the plane did not need to be de-iced. This information was relayed to the pilots, who, well, then progressed with departure. In reality, investigators would conclude that the plane absolutely should have been de-iced. Temperatures were hovering just below zero. It was snowing. The aircraft would still be on the ground for 15 to 20 minutes between when the wings were checked and the actual takeoff attempt, in which time snowfall would increase and ice contamination would take hold, more so on the outer wingtips. But, get this, when the engines are powered up and the booster pumps are switched on, the Fokker accessing the fuel in the tanks, the warm and cold fuel mixes, and even that warmer inside section of the wing cools, which in this case the fuel in the tanks settled at a temperature of about -6 degrees, re-enabling ice to accumulate on the entire wing surface. The scheduled departure time came and went as it passed 11 AM. The plane had been sitting on the ground in snowfall in Skopje for just over 90 minutes, with no de-icing. The flight crew received a new load sheet with the added fuel, and the pilot requested clearance for departure at 11:02. 3 minutes later, they were cleared to start the engines. Flight 301 taxied out to runway 34 for their departure. In the cabin were 3 flight attendants and 91 passengers, for a total of 97 on board, including the people on the flight deck. It would seem that icing did not cross the minds of the pilots, aside from switching on the plane's engine anti-ice system while the pilots were performing the after-start checklist. Aside from this, there was no conversation from either of the 3 people on the flight deck regarding ice. As the plane was taxiing out to the runway, snow precipitation increased from light to moderate, and the pilots had no idea that by this point, ice had built up on the wings to a critical point. Flight 301 was at the end of the runway but was requested to hold due to an inbound plane. Every moment on the ground allowed more ice and snow to contaminate the wing surfaces. The pilots, though, spent the time going through their pre-takeoff checks. The Fokker jet was cleared for takeoff at 11 minutes past 11. The controller in their takeoff clearance went on record to inform the crew again that it was snowing. Visibility was also not great that day at around 900 meters with a low cloud base. The control tower couldn't even see the plane through the thick fog. Sure enough, the engines spool up and the plane accelerates. 30 seconds go by with Captain Biadraga making the standard speed callouts. The Macedonian pilot was at the controls. As we have come to expect in these accidents, everything appeared to be normal, right up until rotation. Once reaching the takeoff speed, the Macedonian pilot flying the aircraft pulled back on the control wheel and angled the nose of the plane into the air and... Can you guess what happened next? Seconds into their climb, heavy vibrations were felt throughout the aircraft as the plane entered the onset of a stall. Moments later, the plane suddenly banked around 10 degrees to the right. The asymmetrical stall characteristics begin to rip roll control away from the pilots. By use of the ailerons and rudder, the pilot flying corrected this sudden bank. This was very quickly followed by a very steep 50-degree bank to the left. The pilots would struggle over the following seconds to keep control of their plane. The second roll was also counted, and for a brief moment, the wings were brought to a level position. The Dutch pilot, Captain Biadraga, suggested disconnecting the autopilot, which is confusing because the autopilot was not connected, but this could be read as the pilot looking for a reason as to why the plane was unexpectedly behaving this way. In the following seconds, though, the plane would very quickly bank over to the right. Like the roll to the left, this second right roll also exceeded 50 degrees, but would continue to increase in bank angle to beyond 60 degrees. Sensing that the pilots were struggling to control their plane, the engineer in the jump seat suggested raising the nose, and in the final seconds before the crash, the pilots tried and even spun the pitch trim wheel in the nose-up direction. But this did little. The plane was in this extreme bank, the pilots unable to gain altitude. The plane stalls, with a maximum sink rate of 2,000 feet per minute. The asymmetry of the stall pushed the Fokker to roll further until it was beyond a 90-degree bank angle. Such performance from an aircraft is untenable. The plane crashed into the ground in this extreme state. It exploded almost immediately as it cartwheeled into the ground, disintegrating into countless parts. The crash and resulting fire killed 83 people, including all but one crew member and 13 passengers. 4 passengers who initially survived the crash later died in hospital. Initially, the accident was investigated by a Macedonian team of investigators. However, the report they published was widely panned as being woefully incomplete, and didn't really address what happened correctly. As the plane was of Dutch origin, the Netherlands picked up the investigation in the end, and in 1996, a complete report was published, where ice contamination of the wings inducing a stall on takeoff, contributing to the loss of roll control, was found to be causal in the disaster. There is a lot that can be said about the meteorological role in these accidents, and you can say whatever you want about the Fokker aircraft and its wings, but I feel it is emerging in the instance we have looked at that proper or adequate practices were not followed. This was the first time an accident like this had occurred with the Fokker 100. The icing issue surrounding the Fokker 28 was widely understood by this point. However, the fact a Fokker 100 had gone down in almost exactly the same way as its older sister plane, the message needed to be sent again. So, as a direct result of the crash in Macedonia, Dutch authorities issued a stern warning to all operators of the Fokker 100. Not only did they emphasize the increased susceptibility to ice, but they also highlighted the need to adhere to strict practices in icy weather. In 1996, Fokker ceased production and shut its doors. However, in the final few years of Fokker 100 production, they introduced that new on-ground heating system for the wing leading edges, which were installed onto the final units that rolled off the production line. Pre-existing units could also be retrofitted with this system. After the Palair disaster, it appears the message was finally heard, and Fokker 100s continued to operate just like their older sisters did for many years, well into the 2000s with a good safety record. Well,
aside from that time that one flipped over on takeoff due to uncommanded reverse thrust, but that's a different story. After 1993, there was never a Fokker plane that crashed because of icing. Well, that was until 14 years later. Do you know something? There is a plane we haven't talked about yet. The Fokker 70, right? Yeah, out of all of the Fokkers, this would be the only sensible one, in that the Fokker 70 has never had a fatal incident in its entire operating life, even to this day. There were a couple of incidents in 2002 and 2004 which relate to icing of the engines, however, those cases are not really relevant to what we're discussing today, and we're not really going to discuss them here. Maybe that's a story for another time, perhaps. Moving on, the next incident on our radar today would occur a little bit later in 2007. On the morning of January 25th, 2007, yet another icing-related incident involving a Fokker jet would occur. It's here we arrive at the case which prompted European aviation authorities to implement a mandate on these planes following the investigation of Flight 7775. Flight 7775 was actually officially operated by an Air France subsidiary, which they simply branded as Régional. The accident Fokker of note was first delivered to another French airline, Air Liberté, before they were acquired by Air France in 2001. The plane left Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport in the morning of January 25, 2007, heading southwest to the city of Pau, near the Pyrenees and the border with Spain, arriving on stand at around 9:40 in the morning. For the pilots, it was a routine morning domestic flight. It can get pretty cold down there in the winter months, and that morning when the Fokker 100 arrived, it was snowing, the outside temperature hovering around 0 degrees. The pilots themselves, a 44-year-old captain and 37-year-old first officer, were substantially experienced. The captain had obtained nearly 3,000 hours in the Fokker 100, while his first officer, though still new to the plane, with just under 300 hours logged in the type, still had over 6,000 flight hours in total. 11:20. 54 passengers and crew boarded Flight 7775 to Paris that morning. When the doors were closed and clearance was given, the pilots taxied the Fokker jet to the north side of the airport for departure from runway 13, initially heading southeast. At no point was the plane de-iced during the turnaround. The plane taxis onto the runway and is in position by 11:26. Takeoff clearance was swiftly given and the throttles were pushed forward. The Fokker 100's two Rolls-Royce Tay engines spool up to high power. The brakes were released and the plane accelerates. Passing through 80 and 100 knots, the pilots check their instruments to find that everything appears to be normal. Just like in all previous cases we have discussed thus far, it was only when the nose left the runway that catastrophe would strike. They reached the V1 speed, and it was at this moment that the crew spotted a flock of birds in the sky. Now, the birds themselves had no direct involvement with the accident, but for a brief moment, their attention was distracted. Startled by the presence of birds, the pilot flying reflexively pulls back on the control wheel a little too quickly, with swifter movement than was necessary. This manifested in an over-rotation to an angle of attack of 15 degrees, greater than what was needed. With a sheet of ice on the wings, this bled lift brought on by separation of airflow from the wings, resulting in an almost immediate stall after takeoff. The plane banks sharply to the left to a peak of 35 degrees. The pilots naturally try to correct it, but then the plane pivots through the roll axis to a 67-degree bank to the right. That's a change of over 100 degrees in a matter of seconds. The pilots have no idea why their plane is behaving this way as they struggle up to an altitude of just 100 feet above the runway. They are startled by another sharp 59-degree bank to the left, at which point the plane begins to drop from the little altitude it gained. The Fokker hits the ground hard and to the right of the runway, bouncing the aircraft. The captain at this time, under pressure and with the understanding that the plane is not in a safe enough condition to fly, aborts the takeoff. However, there is little runway left. I say that, but in reality they weren't exactly on the runway. With just a few hundred meters of space remaining, he reaches for the reverse thrust, which was activated for just a few seconds. The situation looks hopeless as the plane overruns the runway and breaks through the airport perimeter fence.
Flight 7775 was lucky in that beyond the end of runway 13, it's just fields. However, between the end of the runway and the eventual resting point is a small road. And as it just so happened, a lorry was passing through, making its way along the road when this plane happened to cross paths with it. And sadly, it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The left undercarriage landing gear struck the cab of the truck, killing the driver and severely injuring the other passenger. Afterwards, the Fokker jet enters the adjacent field, and by this point, the landing gear had been all but ripped from the fuselage following an impact with an embankment. The plane skids to the right, where it eventually comes to a halt. The passengers and crew evacuated, and all 54 of those on board survived. Unlike many of the previous cases, investigators actually had a rather intact plane to work with on this occasion, preserved in almost its entirety on the day. Investigators were able to establish that the winter weather conditions during the morning of the accident were conducive to ice accumulation. The investigation found that a combination of heavy ice accumulation on the wings and an increased angle of attack on rotation was causal in the accident, just like what happened in Hanover all those years ago. Now, the rotation angle on its own may not have resulted in a stall. However, the presence of ice had dampened the lift performance of the wings, enough so that it brought the plane below what was needed for a safe climb away, and a stall did occur. Furthermore, the investigation highlighted that there could be a distinct lack of understanding of the severity of icing among pilots, which could be causing them to fly a little too close to the edge. This being brought up as several aircraft, including the Air France Fokker, left Pyrenees Airport that day, with all but one of them requesting de-icing. This meant an Airbus A319, an Embraer 135, a Casa 235, and of course the Fokker 100 did not request de-icing. It therefore feels indicative of what we've talked about today that it was only the Fokker plane that crashed. With that, the European Aviation Safety Agency mandated that ice protection systems on Fokker planes be changed. The retrofit for that on-ground heating system for the wings would be required in the EU going forward. We talked about how Fokker had implemented this themselves during the final rounds of production of the Fokkers, following the Palair crash of '93. You'd think, therefore, that would be the end of it, right? But, alas.
Line up runway 05 right, Astronaut line 6 along. Темно стекла сейчас. Вилан! Роты! Ух ты! Что такое? Твою мать!
Bank angle, bank angle.
Что такое? Не знаю. Надо? Что ты делаешь? Поехали. Шли. Убирай шасси. Убирай все. Твою мать!
In a stunning scenario similar to all the others we have discussed in this video spanning back 50 years of aviation history, Bek Air Flight 2100 crashed in an ice-induced asymmetrical stall on takeoff. The pilots tried to bring the plane up but were battling against a massive reduction in lift induced by ice buildup on the wings. The plane banked rapidly, oscillating between left and right. The nose was pitched up with a significant angle of attack, peaking at 20 degrees. The aircraft's tail scraped along the ground, and from what we heard on the cockpit voice recorder, there was some conflict between the pilots when it came to determining a course of action. They actually did manage to get the plane off the ground for about 8 seconds, in which time the landing gear was retracted. However, the over-rotation of the nose was causing less air to enter the engines, and as a result, the engine speed dropped, which had a knock-on effect on the plane's performance. This was clearly observed in the engine performance data on the flight data recorder. Kazakh authorities released an official animation with injected flight data, and we can see how the pilots reacted to the stall. We can see here the high angle of attack, the plane's speed consistently hovering around 140 knots. Flapless, they struggled with such difficulty. Eventually, they ran out of runway, and the Kazakh crew weren't as lucky to stop their plane in a field. Instead, the Fokker 100 jet skidded off the runway, sliding on its belly, drifting to the right of the runway centerline, breaking through the airport boundary where it crashed into a 2-story house. That moment was captured on surveillance footage. This impact killed 13 of the 98 people on board.
Investigators, like their counterparts in Canada in 1989, considered a lot of possibilities when it came to determining the causal factors of this accident. They looked at everything from weight and balance distribution to wake turbulence from the previous departing aircraft. However, all evidence points towards severe ice contamination of the wings, inducing an aerodynamic stall on takeoff. This Fokker 100 should have been thoroughly de-iced, especially when you consider the fact it had been sitting out in the cold without any activity for over a day. The fact the wings weren't treated at all is stunning, frankly. When it comes to ice contamination of the wings, it was made worse in this case as the on-ground leading-edge heating system did not work as intended. Usually, it is supposed to power on when the engines are powered up, borrowing some of that hot bleed air like we discussed earlier. This, the investigation believed, could have provided an additional safety measure. However, there were greater problems the investigation uncovered. Major systemic problems were found in the quality control of de-icing services in Kazakhstan. To quote the Kazakh report,
"At the time of the accident in the Republic of Kazakhstan, there was no fundamental document approved at the state level in the field of anti-icing treatment of aircraft from ground icing. At the level of regulatory documents, there is no provision for the separation of actions and responsibilities of engineering and technical ground and flight personnel for compliance with the concept of a clean aircraft."
In their report, Kazakh authorities called for a number of recommendations that were directed at re-evaluating the dangers of icing in the country. They highlighted that Kazakhstan really needed to get their shit together when it came to understanding why this is so important, especially so for a country like Kazakhstan with a growing aviation industry and also in just being a country where it gets really cold in the winter. Bek Air Flight 2100 is, at least currently, the latest ice-related Fokker mishap. And you know what? It might actually be the last. So, what have we learned? Having now looked through this string of plane crashes going back 50 years, establishing the causal factors and the relationship each one of them had with ice, I think I can come to a conclusion here based off what I've learned from making this video. The Fokker planes are fine and are not dangerous on their own. This is what happens when measures aren't taken, procedures not followed to keep a plane within its safe margins for flight. That is ultimately what these accidents came down to. There were failings, but none of them had much to do with the planes themselves. You have incidents like the original one in Hanover, and those of the Air France case, where it is more or less clear-cut that the plane just wasn't really de-iced. But then you also have those that brushed up against economic factors. Maybe it is worth it to point out some of the financial aspects of some of these accidents. For example, Air Ontario, a fledgling, ambitious airline, needed to have their plane out there, making money, and they clearly did not appreciate the Fokker procedures and the meteorology enough to pull their plane from service to repair it. If they did, then they wouldn't have let their plane fly with a broken APU in the first place, forcing the pilot's hand into a sequence of events that winded up killing them. Maybe LaGuardia might have used Type 2 fluid, or perhaps some of the others could have been de-iced in the first place. I know we are talking retrospectively here with a little benefit from hindsight, but these issues do need to be identified. It's not like icing was ever a problem exclusive to Fokker planes, far from it. Accidents like these have occurred with other planes over the years. In 1982, a Boeing 737 rather notoriously crashed immediately after takeoff for similar reasons to that which we have discussed today, and even more closely related was the crash of Continental Airlines Flight 1713 at Denver in 1987. I want to talk about this real quick because it is interesting given what we've looked at today. This was a DC-9 aircraft, a very similar plane to the Fokker 28. This plane, ahead of departure, was de-iced. However, delays on the ground meant that the holdover time from the fluid that was used had expired, and it wasn't de-iced again. Naturally, when the pilot flying over-rotated on takeoff, that created a stall and the plane subsequently crashed, killing 28 people. Maybe we'll talk about this case in a bit more detail some other time, but the parallels between this accident and that of the Fokker planes are clear. However, different plane, it's got its own problems and different circumstances and so on. The Fokker wings were very efficient and had their benefits. However, the Fokker 28 and later the Fokker 170 were the only planes in semi-widespread use that had this sort of wing profile, with this configuration of eschewed leading-edge devices. Because of that, they had their own set of requirements that some airlines and airports had maybe not appreciated. It's not like it matters much now. As we have established, Fokker went bankrupt in 1996, production of new Fokkers ceased, with the final Fokker 70 leaving the production line in 1997, leaving all of the other units that had been built up to that point, around 280 Fokker 100s or so, leaving all of those to be used up, with increasingly dwindling numbers of them left in the wild today. You may then be thinking, what became of the Fokkers? Well, the Fokker 28 is all but extinct. There are no longer any of them left in commercial service, which ended sometime in the late 2000s, though a few operators held onto theirs in storage for infrequent services. The Fokker 100 and Fokker 70, on the other hand, still have some life left in them, though that time is fleeting. The days of the younger Fokker jets are numbered. The Dutch national airline KLM, which was by far one of the largest operators of the Fokker jets, held onto theirs for quite some time under the Cityhopper division. The airline only retired their last Fokker 70 in 2017. Nowadays, there are very few Fokkers left in Europe at all. In fact, most of them have migrated to warmer climates. For example, the country that appears to be the Fokker sanctuary these days would be Australia, where 3 notable Australian airlines, including Qantas, still fly the Fokker 100 and Fokker 70 today, mostly in Western Australia out of hubs in Perth. Iran is also a popular haven for Fokker jets, though this may be for different reasons. Sanctions on the country have meant that Iranian airlines have been unable to purchase new planes for quite a long time, meaning that Iranian carriers have long sourced their planes on the second-hand market, resulting in a number of Fokker 100s trickling into the country, especially for the domestic services there. Iran and Australia really are some of the last places where these things can be regularly found that you can book a flight with. It is quite fitting, therefore, given the plane's history with ice, that many of them now fly in warmer climates. You'll never have the same snowy, wintry conditions in Australia.
Hello everyone. Wow, you made it to the end. That was a big video, wasn't it? If you enjoyed it, be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't. I know it has been a while since the last upload. I would like to thank you all for your patience whilst I was away to make something like this. My thought process during the production of this video was to give myself more time, and to not be constrained by something like sponsorship deadlines or anything like that. So this video was very much brought to you with the support from my patrons over on Patreon. And if you want to support the channel further to support more videos like this, then you can always join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon starting from £1 per month, and if you are interested, the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. I really can't thank those who have pledged enough. Their support has meant so much to me these past months, and their names are scrolling on the screen right now. So, as always, we've got a bunch of shoutouts to get through, and we'll begin with the business class tier, so in order of which they joined, a big thank you to Brian Cook, Milza, Tammy, Samph, Ted Flores, Dribbly Bob, Christoph Wilkins, and Salman Al Khalifa. And of course, a massive thanks to the new first class tier patrons for their generous support to the channel. A thank you to Auntie S. Mac, Terry Hickox, Will Tanner, and T. Shane. Thank you all so very much. Your support is much appreciated. Thank you. Before I sign off this video, I would like to give personal thanks to a very special someone. Sasha, my amazing girlfriend, who helped me with some of the production aspects of a certain scene in this video. I love her so much. She means the world to me. And now that this video is complete, I'll be taking some time off for Christmas. In fact, the day this video goes live, I'll be traveling back to Denmark to be with her for a while, so I am now hers for the rest of the year. Thank you all so much for watching. You can also follow me on Blue Sky now, and I'll leave a link to that in the pinned comment and stuff. Anyway, thank you all so much, happy holidays, and I shall see you all in 2025. Goodbye!